Welcome back. Today we will start with lecture 2. So, we are in module 2 and today this is lecture 2 of module 2. In this lecture we will be looking at language variation in terms of regional and social variation. Now, these are two types of language variation. Previously we have discussed about language dialect and how dialects are older terms, and today we talk about variations rather than dialects and how these ideas came into being, how what the difference between language and dialect and so on. So, now we will move into the variations themselves. Now, before we get into the regional and the social variations with respect to data and the findings and theories, we have to first understand the background of these studies. So, how these understanding language variations came about, why did they come about and how. So, initially they were the studies with respect to language. This is already understood that a same language might have different, they might be spoken differently across different regions. So, the idea was that there are structural differences, there are lexical differences. So, how did they come about? How is it that slightly different geographical regions will have slightly different manifestation of the same language? So, here we are talking about, we are talking about geographical regional difference in terms of language, we are talking about regional variation. So, this was one of the first things that were studied in a theoretically interesting way, in a proper analytic way. So, this is how dialectology came into being. So, there was an established domain called dialectology that looked at the geographical distribution of different varieties of a language. At that time it was called dialect. So, different dialects of a language and how they are geographically spread, spread over to a large extent over a big area, and beyond which of course, it becomes a different language. So, that is how it all started. And then initially this was focusing mostly on the geographical region, and it was primarily focused on rural areas. Eventually the field expanded, changed and updated, and both urban and rural areas were taken into account. So, but traditionally primary focus was always on the rural population. The reason being the urban areas are more diverse and it is difficult to pinpoint as in what exactly is the representation. So, rural variations do not change that fast. So, that is why the focus was on rural and non-standard, because we are talking about dialect, and those days dialect. And the data primarily in those days data was would always be collected from the norm stands for non-mobile older rural men. So, some kind of a constancy you would try to look at, right, not somebody whose speech constantly changes. For example, the young generation's language changes quite rapidly. That is why the focus was on non-mobile people who have been living in the same place for a long time, old rural men. That is how dialectology started, focusing on rural people, and this is the criteria. So, it traces back the history of these dialectology can be traced back to the British, French and other dialect atlases that were created. The dialect atlases were created in the mid and late 19th century. So, this is how they basically what they did was they would go about collecting data from various regions and collecting data from the representative sample of those regions, and then compare them with the standard dialect, as a result of which the standard variety, as a result of which they would be able to find out how language is changed, how each geographical area has its own way of speaking and so on. This was also called dialect geography at a point. Now, this is an example of the methods that were followed. This is an example from the French linguistic atlas of France. This was based on some field workers were always engaged for the data collection, who would go from village to village with a questionnaire sort of thing. They would be very lengthy questionnaires. Typically, they will have more than 1000 items, and then they will give those things to the local people to translate into the local variety. So, they already had the standard variety with them. They would give the text to give the questionnaire to the people. For example, this is a sample item. When you take a calf away from its mother's milk, what do you say you do? This is one such example. So, that is how the methodology went. So, this is an example. So, what do you say for this kind of a scenario, what do you say for that kind of a scenario, for this object, that event, like this. Similarly, sometimes when children are behaving very badly, their mother will tell them that someone will come and take them away. What do you call this mysterious person? So, the expected answer was bogey, but expected answer was bogey, and then they would wait for the local dialects version to be given to them. So, that is how the data collection used to happen. Over a period of time, things changed in many domains within dialectology. In the 60s, this field became a part of sociolinguistics. Earlier, it used to be a standalone kind of a discipline and domain, and then it became part of sociolinguistics, and as a result, a lot of new things also, new variables, so to say, also became part of it. For example, a strong urban angle also was added to it. The reason for this addition was primarily, this all goes back to Lebov and his very interesting study. However, this happened, this was one important change that happened in the 60s. So, change in progress became one important theoretical construct. Alongside, there were changes in the methodology as well. So, with time, as usual, with time ideas changed, methodology changed. So, this happened here as well. So, in the beginning, early atlases were made, they would have local school teachers or enthusiasts who would translate the standard variety in the local dialect. As we have just seen, the tool that was used, that would be given to school teachers or local enthusiasts. But all of these changed as time passed. So, changes were visible in all domains. For example, initially there will be a single token. So, for the question there will be a single token, eventually that was replaced with multiple token for better analysis, for more reliability. Similarly, in the initial stages, field workers' intuitions were given a lot of importance, but over a period of time modern recording techniques came into being. Now, you had tape recorder, eventually you also had video recording possible. So, starting from completely subjective data collection method to objective methods also came into being. Then initially we had manual annotation. So, it was to be done by some person, but over a period of time there also some changes happened. So, there was a multivariate analysis software called VerbRule. This could check and analyze continuous speech for both reliability test across a number of analysts as well as acoustic analysis. So, similarly, there are many other such variables that were taken into account. So, intra speaker variable, similarly the variability across field workers, and then focus on particular geographical location, ignoring the depth within. So, within area, intra speaker, intra field worker, all these things were ignored before, and eventually more and more fine tuned methodologies came into being. Another important idea within dialect geography and dialectology was the notion of isogloss. Now, the oldest reference of the term go back a bit long time. It goes back to two prominent names. For example, this, and in 1892 the Lithuanian dialectologist Gottfried Beilenstein is probably is the first person who have used this term in 1892 when he was working on the Lithuanian language boundary. So, this is from his the original manuscript where we have the boundaries. So, basically how isogloss works is, they will look at the regional distribution of linguistic items. So, for example, the sa sha difference in Indian, take the Indian context, you can look at the way sa sha difference is maintained or not maintained. So, one particular linguistic feature you can take and then look at the distribution, geographical distribution of that particular item across different regions that you are studying. So, and then they will plot the results on a map as to which item was found in which village, and then there will be a line, they will draw a line connecting the dots. So, for example, exactly where sa is used, so they will connect a line. So, that line will become the dividing line between the usage number 1 versus the usage number 2. So, that is called isogloss. This remained very important variable for a long time, and this is an example of that. That kind of an isogloss. So, this is quoted from Turgill's 2001 work. So, basically if you are looking by feature, so basically isoglosses divided a geographical region on the basis of certain linguistic items. Now, as per one item, the geographical location can be divided into, let us say broadly, roughly north south division, another might just crisscross the domain. So, it is not about there may not be complete mapping of one feature on another, they might just crisscross each other. However, isoglosses were very important in order to understand the distribution of certain linguistic properties over a large area. That is why isogloss remained very crucial for a very long time. Another is the location of the dialect regions. So, if there in any kind of geographical boundary, if we are looking at particular varieties boundary, there will always be a central region and there will be some peripheral region. So, the core region or the central region typically will be those which are dominant in terms of financial and political terms. So, for example, the nerve center of a particular town, let us say town A has a variety which is not found in town B. So, town B has another property, another variation of that same language. Now, within town A also the core financial district or the political, the seat of political power will be the core region of that particular dialect, and the hinterlands will be the peripheral region. These are also important understanding with respect to the geographical distribution of languages or their dialects that were studied. Now, keeping these things in mind, there are models that have been proposed as to how the variations or the similarities among languages emerged. How does it, how is it that the variety 1, variety 2 are similar, but variety 2 and variety 3 are different? How can we account for those, what happened? How do you account for this kind of changes is what the main question that was asked, and then there are a couple of models that are very influential that have tried to answer them. So, first is the family tree model, and then we have the diffusion and the wave theory. These are the two primary theories that we will be discussing. So, family tree model, this is a model to represent in a convenient way the relationship among varieties. So, this was developed in the 19th century as part of historical study on languages, because when in the old times, when the colonial period, during the colonial period, when the more and more languages were studied, more and more languages were people were exposed to, eventually it was found out that languages seem to have, distant languages seem to have similarity, and within a region there might be differences, there might be some kind of a change. As a result, dialects were formed. So, in order to understand historically what are those features, what are those forces that might have played a role, this is where the family tree model comes into being. So, how closely and some languages are related, and what exactly is the distance between language X and language Y, all of these could be very easily nicely portrayed in the shape of a tree. So, this is how the family tree looks like. So, this is how, so the starting with the protoform, the idea was that of a protoform. So, for example, language X and language Y originated from one, let us say a protoform called language XY. So, the protoform does not exist anymore, nobody speaks that form, but you have X and you have Y which share some similarities. Now, that makes X and Y sister languages and the XY variety as the mother language. So, like this if you go, the higher node will have less number of languages, lower node will have more number of languages, and then X can be divided, it might have over a period of time might have bifurcated, trifurcated into X1, X2, X3 like that to Xn, similarly Y also. So, when you are trying to back form, today you might be at the fourth layer, where X has further divided into X A1, X A2, X A3 like that. And then you look at the similarities across some varieties and the similarity of these to the other varieties in a different geographical, completely different geographical location, thereby you can back form into the protoform. That is what the family tree model basically talks about. On the other hand, diffusion and wave theory talks about, this is an alternative method to family tree model. Now, this model assumes that changes in languages spread outwards from centers of influence to the surrounding areas, like waves in a pool. When you drop a stone in a pool, the way the waves disperse, that is exactly how changes happen. So, there is a core area and then from that core area changes will take place. As you go further, the changes will be similarly represented. So, this model takes care of the intersecting isogloss problem. Intersecting isogloss problem we just talked about in the previous segment here. So, one single geographical location may have multiple crisscrossing isogloss, that is better understood through diffusion model. So, family tree model, this is the most important and most popular of models of language change. So, the idea is that there are two primary hypotheses within this. One is the regularity hypothesis. So, language changes in a regular way. So, there is a particular property, let us say the schwa deletion in some of the East Indian languages. Schwa is there in Hindi, but it is not there in Bangla or it is not there in Assamese. So, there is a particular way that in a regular way that languages probably have changed between these and that. That is the idea. So, languages change in a regular way. The result of this hypothesis is that observed similarities led to the assumption that they descended from the same ancestor. So, for example, as I just said, Bangla and Assamese do not have the schwa. So, if that is the case, then that means both of these languages have descended from a common ancestor, as opposed to say another language which has maintained the schwa. So, there must have been a bifurcation at a higher level, that means an older stage of language change. We are talking about hundreds of years here. That is the idea of regularity hypothesis. The alternate to it would be that languages changed in random ways and ended up in being similar at some point of time, because languages, diverse languages may sometimes have similarities. German and Sanskrit have lot of similarity. How did it happen? In fact, all of these started from there only. So, and then you have relatedness hypothesis. So, similar languages are related. Thus, the similarity is not accidental, but the result of a process. Today it sounds commonsensical, but when these ideas were first proposed, they were quite new, because languages very spoken in different geographical regions having similarity. Why do they have similarity? Why do they have similar kind of regular regular grammatical properties? Why is it so? So, there must have, if they share certain properties, means they are from the similar from same kind of ancestral language. So, that is where it all started. So, this family tree talks about sisters and mothers, sister languages and mother languages. So, this is how it is a downward tree kind of a structure. This is an older version of a tree model, one of the oldest ones, and this was let us say more beautiful looking. It has it actually looks like a tree, and this is how initial. So, it goes back all the way to 1880. The work back to Gales. So, he gave this this all starts. So, the primitive language, the Lang primitive, and then it goes on to as you see the Celt, and then from each node. So, from this node you have these branches, and from this you have these branches, and then it goes till here whatever remains, and from here you have. So, this is how the understanding of tree structure was created, and this is how it was visually represented, because there must be a common ancestors of the languages that share certain properties, that is the idea. So, this Sir William Jones gave this idea, as I was saying, the Sanskrit and several European languages, it goes all the way back to 1786, when he figured out that Sanskrit and German has a lot of similarity. So, this is how it was. So, this is Vedic Sanskrit, this is Greek, Gothic, like Proto-Indo-European, and then you see there are similarities across these. So, there is across these there are similarities, and that is what made him think that there is something happening here, that these languages have certain properties which are similar, meaning they probably would have descended from the same kind of ancestor. Later other scholars including Gale, we just saw Gale's tree, and similarly others also have expanded the idea, and then they popularized the notion of language tree. So, that is what about family tree. The other theory in this domain as to how geographical variations came about, this is about the wave theory. This is the second theory. Now, this theory believes that language change happened in a wave like fashion. Some changes spread and affected some languages, but not others. So, these are like waves, and hence the name. Waves represent different linguistic features. So, one particular feature might have spread, the other features might not have spread, and so on and so forth. So, all languages are thus likely to share features with the neighboring languages if they are part of the same wave. So, similarly again going back to our Bengali and Assamese example. So, the schwa deletion, the non-existence of schwa at the end or in the vowel space as well, because both of these languages share this feature, we can say that because they are neighboring languages, probably during the changes in the wave of change, these two languages have ended up sharing the same feature. That is also possible. Now, these theories are not as simple as I am telling them, but because this is not part of our main agenda. So, we are just keeping it at very brief here. This in many cases wave theory does better in explaining certain kinds of changes and certain kinds of differences as well as similarities across languages, but in some other cases they do not. So, this is a problem. But then there are sometimes it is easy to understand them as complementary rather than as contrasting kind of theories, but this is where we leave the theories. To sum up, both theories have been criticized for their shortcomings in later times. Of course, these are both are old theories. To summarize, one can say that they are complementary, they do not always. So, some of the ideas are taken care better by one theory, some other by other theory. So, then there is so this is about regional variations across geographical location, regional variations, and then we have a very important landmark study by Labov that I was mentioning in the beginning. This is called Martha's Vineyard study. So, what he did was he compared New York City and Martha's Vineyard in trying to see if there are differences in the the way languages are spoken, and what he showed that in contrast to expectations of the time, rural populace also showed a lot of heterogeneities. Remember, we talked about that initially it was the rural population that was focused on, the norm was the source of data, urban population were not, because urban population is supposed to show a lot of variation in their data and rural are not. But this particular study showed that even in the rural populace you might see a lot of variation. So, the typical variables were age, gender, ethnicity and class. So, in case of Martha's Vineyard, the variables also included location, occupation, ethnicity, desire to stay on the island, orientation to the place and so on. You can see the number of variables that Lebow's study found out that impacted even rural spoken variety of a language. So, this actually opened the floodgate of studies with respect to social variation. So, even within the rural area, the geographical Martha's Vineyard is not a large area. So, within that area also you can have a really complex heterogeneous variety of language spoken, and how are they different, why are they heterogeneous, on the basis of all of these variables. So, that means the social variation is another possibility. So, basis that now we know that there are two kinds of dialects or two kinds of variations that are possible in language. Now, today we call them regional variations and social variations, right. This is how it came about. So, regional variation primarily means the varieties that differ across geographical area. So, one area to another you have differences, the variations are visible on the basis of area, geographical area, language variations with respect to geographical area. And then we have some examples here for in many Indian languages also show variation, as well as we have talked about the similarities and variations with respect to Sanskrit and other languages, but here we have some Indian examples. So, you have Manipuri for example, broadly speaking there are three different variations, geographical variations within Manipuri language, Manipur Valley, Barak Valley and hilly region. So, depending on these three areas, I have some examples here. So, morphological level you can have difference, you can have difference in the phonological level, and this is how some of the examples I have quoted here. So, this is an example of what we mean by geographical variation or local regional variety. So, within an area there are differences at various levels among the language varieties spoken. This is what is a regional variation. So, we have Manipur Valley, Barak Valley and hilly region. Depending on these regions we have regional variations. Similarly, you have the Hindi dialects. Hindi has a number of variations. So, according to the 2001 census of the Government of India, there are about 50 variations, 50 dialects within Hindi, that is and it has a varying number of speakers. So, some variations may have as few speakers as 11,000, and then some varieties have 250 million, which is for standard Hindi. So, Hindi includes group of dialects spread over a geographical area of thousands of kilometers. So, these are some of them which I have quoted from a 2011 study. This divides the Hindi variation into 5 different types: Western Hindi, Eastern Hindi, Rajasthani, Bihari and Pahari, and each of these variations also include a number of languages. So, for example, variations, Western Hindi includes Khari Boli, Braj, Bundeli, Haryanvi, Kannauji and Nimari. Similarly, Eastern Hindi has Avdhi, Bagheli, Chhattisgarhi and so on. So, each of these are all regional variations, broad variations, and within that you have smaller variations. Some data from this work is also I have included here. You can go through some of the diphthongs, how the diphthongs differ from one variation to another. So, this is an example. And then we have social variety, social dialect. So, social dialect is different, as we have seen in the case of Martha's Vineyard study. It does not overlap with the regional varieties. It is independent of regional variation, and this is based entirely on social groups. So, within one geographical region you may have different social variations based on certain kinds of grouping. It can be based on class, it can be based on gender, it can be based on various other factors. So, they as a result, people belonging to same social class in different geographical areas may speak different. Similarly, at the same time within the same geographical region, people may speak differently based on the social class. So, there is this two-way distinction of language variation, right. So, if you are let us say if you are the women, the way women speak. So, the way women speak may be similar in Eastern Hindi as well as Western Hindi, like that. There are this kind of intersecting possibilities that exist. One of the older studies in case of India goes back to Gumper's 1958 study, where they looked at linguistic variation to social variation in the village, in a particular village near Delhi. So, they looked at the language structure with respect to the caste. So, they had by Hindu caste membership with Brahmins and then Rajputs and all of that. So, this is how they divided the language the class wise population and with respect to the language. What they found out was that the Brahmins, Rajput, Vaishyas and artisans, they avoid regional dialect and innovate new forms to distinguish themselves. Bhangis on the other hand speech closest to regional dialect, they lack certain phonological contrasts, then similarly many others. So, he gives a very detailed breakup of the language varieties spoken within the same geographical location, but based on the different kinds of castes. Similarly, he also includes Muslims as a different group altogether, and their speech he says resembles the untouchable castes. So, this is one of the oldest, this is 1950 all the way to 1958. It is a pretty old study, but this is one of the first studies on social variation in an Indian language. And then this is sourced from CIL Mysore's data. So, in social variation in Kannada for example, so based on gender, based on education, based on generation, language the variations have been found. So, variations within the language usage within Karnataka, but social variation. So, this is another. So, social dialects as a result they are called social dialects, social variation or social dialects spoken by particular group within a large geographical area. So, there are these kind of differences. So, social class, gender, age, ethnicity, network, all of that. So, in theory, since individuals typically belong to several different groups simultaneously, their speech pattern might be taken to reflect the simultaneous intersection of their social categories and experiences. For example, the young upper middle class group. So, you can segment the society in terms of class, in terms of age, in terms of gender, they all are separate categories in their own right, but every individual at any given time may belong to more than one of these classes. So, that is as a result of which their speech variety will be at an intersection of all of these markers. So, some of the important studies in this domain have they deal with one of them deals with pronunciation, and then we also have some lexical differences. Let us look at the pronunciation studies. The one of the most famous one, that case of H dropping in New Zealand English. So, social groups can be identified by their preference for certain sounds. It is not the absolute presence or absence, but the preference. So, some groups might prefer to use the H sound, the H sound, some groups might not prefer. That was the study. So, this is what they did was they had radio broadcast records of two elderly persons' account of their childhood in Edwardian Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. So, this is taken, the data is taken from two elderly persons radio broadcast, where they were talking about their childhood. Now, these two people are from different areas, and as a result of which they were looking at if there are differences. So, this is I quote, the two recordings were analyzed to see whether there were differences between the speaker in the terms of the numbers of H they dropped in words like house. So, the ha will be silent, they will not use the ha. So, they wanted to see if there is a difference between the speakers. It was found that Marjorie did not omit a single H, while George Davis, these are the two people whose data they were discussing, they dropped 83% of the H in which occurred in his interview. So, and this was pegged on to their social backgrounds. Marjorie and Davis, George Davis, they belong to two different social classes, and they showed a very different pattern of H dropping, and this is what they this was taken as an important property of the difference in the speech form of these two people representing two different social classes. Example of comparative use of H difference is also has been done in British English. So, this study looks at Norwich and West Yorkshire social groups, and there you can see from the graph that the two groups, these are social groups, and how they differ in terms of their H, use of H. And then you have grammatical differences as well, for example, in case of social classes. So, here we have a very important construct of the Bernstein codes. For example, there are many studies have been done. So, you can have these negative forms. In one case you can say nobody wants any chips, another group might say nobody don't want no chips. I do not have to tell you which group says what, which this is already understood. So, social groups might have differences in terms of preference for certain sounds as well as for certain grammatical structures. Now, of course, this we will discuss it at length in the next lecture. These are some pointers. Another important pointer when we are discussing about dialects, about variations of types of variations, the another important notion is that of accent. Now, we might sometimes confuse dialect with accent. Accent does not tell us about a dialect. Accent is a term that is typically reserved for patterns of pronunciation, typical of a particular region or a social group. However, when in order for a language variety to be called a variety, the difference need not be only in terms of the sound system, but also there will be difference at lexical level and at the grammatical level. So, accent is having a different accent does not mean you are speaking a different dialect. So, that is the other thing that needs to be talked about when we discuss dialects and variations. Now, accents have been studied, and accents are also very interesting if you think in terms of the attitude factor. Attitudes, because language is a social thing, attitude always is an important variable to study language use and language change and language acquisition or whatever you have. Similarly, for variations. Now, accent is something that they show certain kinds of patterns. So, accent that is perceived as that of the standard variety or higher variety are reacted to as authoritative, pure and more logical, refined, etc. So, if you have an accent as in the properties, the sound related property, the phonological properties, if your language has that kind of if you have those sets of properties, then it will be considered a more logical, refined and standard variety and so on. This is a reason why advertisements regularly use standard or educated version to market products that are expertise based. Now, this attitude to accent is so ingrained in a society, it will in the most telltale sign of this will be seen in the TV commercials, where they will play on this, where the commercials will play on this to market their products. So, any product that is expertise based will not use language that is not considered standard. It will not be used with a not very polite accent, it will be always used with the higher form of the accent. On the other hand, if you want to say something, if you want to sell something that is locally targeted, local accents to highlight the natural ingredients in food products, etc. So, you want to these days the organic farming is all the rage. So, you will see if you are trying to highlight the factor that this particular products come from a particular village in particular state. So, in order to highlight that factor, you might use the local accent. That is how accent is played upon. Not only it is there in the attitude of people, but this is also how it is given back to us by various kinds of methods. Another interesting domain with respect to dialect is that of register. Now, dialects tell us who you are. So, the you can locate the person, locate the speaker in terms of the geographical location or the social group that they might belong to. So, if you belong to, let us say your language will tell us if you are a gang member. New York gang members have been studied extensively. So, you locate the person as to who they are, where they come from. On the other hand, register is a language variety. It is somewhat like dialects, but this is kind of a usage dependent kind of a variety, because it is the particular domain where you use language in a particular way, like legal register. Even if you speak English, if you are a good high proficient user of English language, if you are given a legal document to read, you will have some difficulties, because it uses the legal register. That is what a register is. So, register is a domain specific use of language. So, you can have legal register, you can have let us say for various purposes. So, the administrative language is different, judiciary language of judiciary is different, language of religious purposes are different. So, if we use language in that way, you will know what the person is currently doing. So, what is the let us say what is the occasion of using, what is the domain of usage and so on. So, that is how you locate. So, with the help of register you can locate the domain of use rather than the origin of the person. So, this is some say that registers show what you are doing, what you do, for example. So, we have some examples here. If you say, our merciful Father in heaven, grant us the strength to do thy will, of course, you are not talking about this person is not talking to a friend in a marketplace. That is how you know. So, the register is a domain specific usage of language in a particular, typically in this kind of a very specific purposes. In this case it is religious. So, this is in a church, most probably the setting is a church, like that, that is a register. These are some, and there is another example there. And then you have another connected domain which is called style, dialect versus style. So, the style is the way you speak, it need not be grammatically different, but it is just a particular kind of a topic dependent or environment dependent change or participant sometimes. So, formal versus informal, that is about style. The language that you use in a formal setup is not something you will be using in an informal setup. So, speech with friends versus the same person talking to a teacher in a classroom, the language will differ. So, that is the style of speaking. Similarly, the environment. So, different stations, for example, different kinds of situations. So, in a football match the discussion will be of one type, in the boardroom the language will be different and so on. So, to whom, the variables will be to whom, the relationship between the speaker and the hearer. This is a domain within style. So, this is called audience design, where the speaker attitude, that attitude is tuned to the hearer's perspective. So, who the person is, who are you addressing. So, the meeting was cancelled versus the meeting was called off. Same thing, not much of a difference, but the choice of words tell us that the setting was different. That is what is all about style. So, we have discussed in this module, in this lecture, variations, language and variations, how language can have primarily two different kinds of variations, regional variation and social variation, and then we have also discussed some of the related concepts which are not considered variations, but they are also related. So, in terms of register, in terms of style and in terms of accent. So, here we end this lecture. We will take up specific issues from in the next lecture. Thank you.